Konnichiwa. This is the Shogunstein, and this is a look at the Shogun miniseries that came out in 2024, and then the kind of compare it to the 1980 classic series. Shogun is basically the story of how Tokugawa Ieyasu unified Japan and became Shogun, and then the Sengoku period, and his family would be in power until about 1868 with the Meiji Restoration. Sped up in 1853 when Commodore Perry showed up with the U.S. Navy, Treaty of Kanagawa, forcing Japan to open for trade. So Tokugawa Ieyasu in 1600 unified Japan. This is a comic novel that I picked up in Japan several years, well, more than several years ago. It's a time period I'm very interested in. So we have Ieyasu. I also picked this up in first time I went to Japan. This is a Japanese comic book series where it's sort of an imposter. Tokugawa Ieyasu is killed, and his kind of body double took his place. Very interesting series also. But my favorite book of all time, and here's my little Tokugawa collection here, is Shogun. James Clavell. This is a novel about, well, in the novel it's Toranaga, but it's basically Tokugawa Ieyasu, and this is part of what's today grouped together with several of his other books that have some similar characters and things that connect them. And I'm not sure if when he wrote it, he was initially calling this part of his quote-unquote Asian saga, but you have Taipan, which is a great book, which is basically about Hong Kong. And then you have Noble House, which was more of a direct sequel to Taipan, which was about, at the time, modern-day Hong Kong. And again, you have some of the similar threads that connect these books. Shortly before Clavell died, he wrote a book called Gaijin, which was supposed to deal with the time around the Meiji Restoration. I'm not a big fan of that book, and I think it's about 300 pages of a good book, and I don't know what happened to the rest of it. Clavell died shortly after. I don't know if that had anything to do with it. And there's also another book that deals with the Islamic Revolution in Iran in, 1978, 1979, with the Ayatollah Khomeini taking power. That's called Whirlwind. And they're all part of what's known as the Asia Saga today. That's how they're kind of grouped together. And again, don't forget King Rat. King Rat was the first book that he wrote. And there are similar characters in each, similar families. So again, I don't know what would have happened if he hadn't passed away when he did, or if that was what they originally intended. But Shogun is the story of Toranaga and Blackthorn, who is Will Adams, who is a British, merchant on a Dutch ship who washes, the ship crashes in Japan. And it was made into a miniseries in 1980 and then just redone on Hulu recently, 2024. So I want to talk about the differences in both of the series, what I liked, what I didn't like. And again, either way, check out the book. I really, really recommend Shogun. I really recommend Taipan. I really recommend Noble House. I wasn't as big a fan of King Rat as I thought I would be. And I never really made it much past, the first few pages of Whirlwind. And I didn't like Gaijin. I read it once, didn't like it. I tried reading it again and still didn't like it. But man, I love Shogun. So what is the base story? Well, the base story, again, you got to have some background. Japan had an emperor, and then there's a time period where the emperor, fell out of power. The emperor's in Kyoto, and you had the various daimyos. So you had a feudal system in Japan similar to Europe. You had the emperor who was on top, but he lost power. You had a shogun, the military general, that's sort of the head daimyo, the nobles. You have the samurai, you have the peasants. And interestingly, on the bottom, you have the merchants. The merchants were considered the lowest because they dealt in business with the gaijin, the foreigners, and that was looked down upon. So they're actually lower than the peasants. Ironically, it'll be the merchants who are on the bottom who will help orchestrate the Meiji Restoration, bring the emperor back in 1868, and the Tokugawa family will be removed from power. But in the Sengoku period, for about 300 years, there's no daimyo that's strong enough to unify Japan. So you had these warlords, you had these daimyos fighting to become the shogun. Ultimately, you're going to get Hideyoshi, Tokugawa Ieyasu coming into the final three, and then Oda Nobunaga. And Oda Nobunaga is an important person, especially for the Shogun story, because Mariko, the character, it's supposed to be based on her family as being a part of in the Shogun novel, her father is one of the people who plotted to assassinate Oda Nobunaga, who was very cruel. He was on the path to unifying Japan, and, he was a cruel person. He nearly completed the unification of Japan, and his own people turned on him. He eventually committed seppuku rather than be captured. But in the novel, Mariko's son, her character is supposed to be the daughter of one of the people who turned on Oda Nobunaga. So when Oda Nobunaga was basically killed in this assassination, committed suicide after being wounded, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the Taiko, will take power in Japan. He pretty much unifies Japan. Again, this is another part of the story in Shogun. He unifies Japan, but he rose up through the ranks. He was born poor. He was born a peasant, worked his way up through Oda Nobunaga's army. So technically, he was kind of the shogun, but the other daimyo never fully accepted him because of his non-noble birth. So he had power, but he didn't completely close the deal there. Also, he wanted to invade China. To do so, he had to go through Korea, and he had a very unsuccessful invasion that he led of Korea, which hurt his brand a little bit. When he dies, he had a very young son. And again, this is part of the plot of the book in both shows. He had a very young son who is going to be the heir of the throne. And Tokugawa, Toranaga, and the other head daimyo were supposed to protect the heir until he's old enough to rule. So the Lady Ochiba character is supposed to be the mother of Hideyoshi's heir. Obviously, the daimyo, Tokugawa, is not going to protect the heir, though they all going to claim they are. And ultimately, in 1600, Tokugawa Ieyasu will unify Japan. He will defeat the other daimyo and become the ruler, and his family will rule for over 200 years. But there is still one hiccup. And again, the heir, which was more prominent in the new version, the heir and his mother, kind of gathered a Ronin at the Osaka Castle. This is about 1614. And there's one last campaign between the Tokugawa family, Ieyasu, and the heir, who Tokugawa was supposed to be protecting. And after the Battle of Osaka Castle, the Hideyoshi's family is wiped out. So Sekigahara is, where Tokugawa does take control, but he has that one last, battle he's got to do because the heir was still there. He was gaining some momentum, as many of the Ronin samurai, those people on the losing side of Sekigahara, were going to Osaka Castle, and that's going to be the last big battle. Now, Tokugawa Ieyasu had help from the Englishman Will Adams, and the Blackthorn character is based on Will Adams. So, both miniseries, let me spoil alert here, they're both fantastic. I love the 1980 series, Richard Chamberlain. I love the new version, 2024. I love the book. So I love all three. I love this time period. So I do recommend both. I recommend reading the book. So, what to me are some of the big differences? This is just my take on it, and you might have your own opinion. I do recommend both. In 1980, we didn't have the internet, so we didn't have a lot of the technology we have. We didn't have cable, we didn't have travel channel. My point being, I think in 1980, we didn't know a lot about Japan. You couldn't just look things online. There weren't all these things on TV or these travel shows. So I think the 1980 version of Shogun is more for the 1980 audience that doesn't necessarily know a lot about Japanese culture, maybe didn't learn a lot about it in school, maybe didn't travel, maybe didn't have contacts in Japan. So I think the presentation of the 1980 version, and that's the one with Richard Chamberlain as Blackthorn, is more that kind of fish out of water, more from Blackthorn, Will Adams' point of view of trying to learn Japanese culture, and ultimately, I think that character is a fan of Japanese culture, but it's more from his point of view, not because of any kind of cultural appropriation or anything that the Wake people would say today. I think, again, in 1980, the average person watching that series on TV in 1980 didn't know a lot about Japan. I think when this book came out, people who read it, this might have been their first taste of Japanese history and culture. I think today, if you take a world history class in high school, certainly if you're in an advanced placement world history class, but I think even in a regular level world history class, you do get Japanese history, and you probably learn about, Tokugawa, the Meiji Restoration, and a little bit about this time period. So I think the 2024 version takes into consideration that people know things about Japan. Do they know the history of, Hideyoshi and Oda Nobunaga and Tokugawa? Maybe not, but I think they have a better understanding of Japanese culture. And I think the new version works on the assumption that we know a little bit more about Japan. And that's why you get a lot more of the Japanese point of view. Would that version have worked in 1980? Probably not. But in 2024, yes, that's what we're going to want. As a criticism, I would say this. There was a lot of inside baseball. Again, as someone, I'm not trying to show off here, but I know a lot about Japanese history. I have a side hustle in world history. I've made several trips to Japan. I've read a lot about Tokugawa. I know a lot about this time period. I know a lot about Oda Nobunaga, Hideyoshi. And there were things that were going on in the series that I knew. I understood what was going on. I understood that Toranaga was Tokugawa. I understood that, when they were talking about Mariko-san's flashback scenes, I understood what was going on. If I didn't know Japanese history, I'd be like, what the heck is going on? So I think if you watch the 2024 version and you were a little confused, I think that's a legit criticism. I think it did assume that you knew more about Japanese history, and we do know more about Japanese history and culture today, which is a good thing. But I think some audience might not know all the minutia of the Sengoku period, whereas again, someone like me, it was I loved it. I loved every minute of it because I found myself giving commentary the whole time I was watching because I understood exactly what was going on, and the whole dynamic of the. Again, Blackthorn is English. He's working for the Dutch. They're Protestant. And then you have these Portuguese characters, Catholic, that whole dynamic. So I loved both for that. But again, I think as a criticism, I would say that, and both a criticism and a thing that makes it better, you do get more of the Japanese point of view in the 2024 version, but at the same time, it might just be a little too inside baseball. Some people were critical of the ending of the 2024 series. Now, again, that's exactly the way it ends in the book. There's very little mention of Sekigahara. Sekigahara in 1600 is a huge battle in Japanese history. It's very important. It's not an important part of the book. It's mentioned for a paragraph at the end. This isn't Game of Thrones where there's a big battle scene at the end of the book with Sekigahara. The book ends with a paragraph about it, and the series, there's a little bit of kind of a flash forward towards on the last episode. So people expecting that, that's not what the book was. Now there's talk about a sequel. Now there's no sequel to the book directly. Again, Taipan, Noble House, Gaijin, they all take place after the events of Shogun, but there's no direct sequel. If they were going to sequel it, yeah, maybe they are going to give you more Sekigahara. Maybe they are going to give you more about the Battle of Osaka Castle and the final, falling out between Hideyoshi's heir, the Taiko, and Tokugawa Ieyasu Toranaga. And that would be, again, something completely original. I mean, not original from Japanese history. There is no book like that Clavell wrote. Performances in both series are fantastic. You had the legendary samurai actor in the 1980 version. Richard Chamberlain back in the day was the king of the miniseries. The new version, I thought everyone was fantastic. So I really do recommend both. I didn't like one over the other. Again, the 2024 one was great for me where I am now in my understanding of Japanese history and culture. I feel it kind of reflects how much more I know about it than I did, say when I first got out of college or when I first read Shogun. They're both fantastic, and I do recommend watching both to see those kind of changes and to see the difference between how it's presented in 1980 and how it's presented in 2024. They're both great. And again, even better, read the book. So I really, really enjoyed both versions. My only criticism, one other criticism I'd have maybe of the 2024 one, there were a couple of scenes like the Game of Thrones where there's some fighting and it was kind of dark. I hate when they do that. Don't do all the dark lighting. I wish they had lit it a little better, a little easier to see what was going on. So maybe my only other criticism of the 2024 version. Great job on both. Love the book, love the Clavell books. I really enjoyed the series. Now all those episodes are streaming and go right to it. Again, big difference. I felt, again, 1980 version, more from the Blackthorn, Will Adams point of view, where again you got the Englishman, Angus-san, who is kind of, fish out of water, learning about this culture that he has no idea about. Whereas again in 2024, I feel the filmmakers correctly assume we know a lot more about Japan. If you don't know a lot about Japan, maybe the 2024 version might be a little more confusing. So maybe start with the original. But again, I would watch both. I would read the book. Great job. Loved it. Do I want to see a sequel? It'll depend on the writing. Clavell was awesome. I love this book. If they do a Shogun sequel, and again, if they're going to continue Toranaga's story, I would love to see a version of what happened at Osaka Castle with the draining of the moats and then that big battle. I would love to see it. I just hope they do the writing the right way. So this is my thoughts on the Shogun book, the 1980, and the 2024 miniseries. This is the Shogun Steen out.